Deep into History is independent and proudly listener supported. Before we begin, I'd like to thank my newest patrons who went to patreon.com/deepintohistory and pledged their support to keep this experience we share ad-free and thriving. CJ, my new historian, I salute you and thank you from the center of my being. A special thank you to Cindy, who generously decided to support the show at an elevated level. So, Cindy, your level of support for Deep into History is peerless. Consider this a foreword. Because of your support, encouragement, and the sheer joy I get from putting in so much research, effort, and time into my scripts, Deep into History has gone from a tiny indie podcast to the verge of mainstream success over the last 5 years. As a fan of so many podcasts, one of my favorite things was to hear a show evolve over time. The recording, the voices, the production, all mature as the hosts figure out their vision for this ever evolving craft. My show is no exception. I was recently speaking to one of my original listeners, who has since become a dear friend, Sadie Mae Sage. She mentioned how far I've come from my early days when she could hear me turning the pages of my scripts on the recording. I had to laugh because it's so true. When I started this show, I had no idea how to record, and I couldn't stand the sound of my voice. And though I'm still far from perfecting my craft, my skills have come a long way. I have a great affection for my early scripts, and I am not seeking to rewrite history, if you will. However, I thought it would be fun to go back and revisit them. In truth, they seem positively quaint in comparison to my newer multi-part epics. The originals will stay up forever on Patreon and Spotify, but I thought you would enjoy hearing old school Deep into History with my hard-won clarity? Let's call it that. I have only made minor tweaks to the script to match my newer narrative flow. I hope you enjoy this trip back to my very first episode. Consider that as we go forward. And with that said, this forward comes to an end. This is Deep into History, and I'm your host, Arjun Hundal. This is the tale of a war for the greatest prize in all of Europe, a war between three of the most puissant warriors their age ever produced, a war whose outcome was so shocking that historians of old had no choice but to declare that it ended one age and began another. A saga so vivid that it inspired one of history's best comic strips in the form of the Bayeux Tapestry. And if this was indeed the grand finale of the play we called the Dark Ages, then surely it saved its best for its last act. 3 heads, 1 crown, 2 will fall, 1 will take it all. So take a deep breath, let it out slowly, put some smoke in the air if you choose, and just let your mind flow to my voice as we go deep into the year 1066 in the Common Era and experience the epic Battle of Hastings. Welcome to the War of the Three Kings. To understand the events of 1066, we first need to go back a few years and get to know the English king, Edward the Confessor. He was considered an extremely religious man in a time where the church had a huge role in everyone's lives. As his name suggests, he was known for spending hours closeted with priests confessing his sins, and one would assume atoning for them, perhaps even inventing new sins to atone for. All I can say is that I've known a few ultra-religious people in my time, and charismatic, they are not. King Edward only came to power with the consent of a few powerful great lords, called earls, over whom he could only ever exercise nominal control. Such was the power structure in England at the time. First among these was Earl Godwin and his 5 sons. It is the power struggle between the Godwins and the king that would set up the showdown of 1066, and to a large extent, the Battle of Hastings itself. You see, Earl Godwin and his sons controlled so much of the country that they could virtually dictate policy to the king. Just one example of their power was that Godwin forced King Edward to marry his daughter. One might think that the marriage might have brought the two powers closer together, but it seems to have had the opposite effect. Within a few short years, the Godwins were in open rebellion against the king. Blood was spilt, and they were forced into exile. However, given their power, popularity, and support in England, the king was forced to relent and allow them to return and reassume their positions. 2 of Earl Godwin's sons would play crucial roles in the events of 1066. Harold, his firstborn, called Harold Godwinson, and Tostig, a schemer and plotter whose lust for power may well have led to the destruction of his country. Keep the name Tostig in mind. He'll re-enter our tale soon. Harold Godwinson was a proven warrior who had learned to lead men in the near constant wars on the Welsh marches. He was fearless in battle and loved by the people. After his father died of natural causes, Harold Godwinson became the most powerful man in England. It was shortly after the death of his father that Harold went on a voyage across the English Channel. But the waters were turbulent, and he was shipwrecked, soon finding himself the hostage of William, the Duke of Normandy. South, across the Channel, the Duchy of Normandy was in essence a Viking colony, under nominal vassalage to the King of France. A sentiment reflected in its name, for Normandy means land of the Northmen. In the previous centuries, France was under near constant attack from Viking raiders. And in desperation, the French king offered the lands that would become Normandy to a Viking chieftain named Rollo, in exchange for his fealty, converting to Christianity, and guarding the coasts and rivers that led to Paris and other inland towns against future Viking raids. Thus, Rollo became the first Duke of Normandy. After a few generations, the Vikings, now called Normans, were fully Christian, yet had lost none of their Norse fervor for war. You might call them berserkers for Christ. Though they often fought against other regions of France, they still did homage to the French king, and after a century, they were more culturally French than Viking. Duke Robert, William's father, built Normandy into a military powerhouse, centered on their famous cavalry. After years of subduing his enemies and ensuring that the duchy was secure, he departed on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. But before he left, he formally recognized William, his illegitimate son, as his heir. Crucially, he took oaths from many of his most powerful vassals to protect the rights of the 8-year-old boy until he came of age and he could rule in his own right. This turned out to be very important because Duke Robert fell ill and died on his way back from Jerusalem, making his very young son William the new Duke of Normandy. However, even with the sworn oaths, William's rise was not assured, as much of the nobility sought to remove him from the picture. Many of his protectors died defending him and protecting his rights. He was continually stalked by assassins, and no less than twice they nearly succeeded in killing him. On one occasion, an 11-year-old William woke suddenly when his guards burst through the door, only to find his cousin in the next bed with his throat slit, dead. The assassin had missed his intended target. His enemies tried to undermine him in other ways. They gave him the title the Bastard of Normandy, which was meant as an insult and to humiliate him in the eyes of the peasants and nobles. This did not succeed. As the hard years of his childhood passed, he survived. He trained his mind in the wisdom of the ancients and his body in the Norman martial arts. He mastered horsemanship and the complex maneuvers that Norman cavalry were famous for. He endured the deaths of his friends and family, along with the indignity of hiding from his enemies. Then, on his 16th birthday, the French king sent word that he officially recognized him as duke and his loyal vassal. Politically, it was an extremely shrewd move. After all, William was the designated heir, was of an age, and with some minor assistance dealing with some of his more powerful enemies, the French king would assure himself of William's fealty. It was with this support that William took his bloody, and I would say just, revenge on his father's vassals who had plotted his death and were responsible for the deaths of his friends and loved ones. William took the title of bastard and wore it like a badge of honor. The moment his last enemies lay dead at his feet, blood dripping from his sword, a declaration went out that he was William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, and any who disputed this would become a feast for crows. The crucible of his childhood and the battles he fought to protect his birthright had transformed the small boy into one of Europe's greatest warriors and a feared battlefield commander. It was around this time that Earl Godwin and his sons revolted against King Edward and were soon forced into exile. The king had no children, so he sent a letter to Duke William in Normandy that recalled their kinship, and because of their shared blood, he named William the heir to the throne of England. After the rebellion was settled and the Godwins had returned from exile, King Edward actually changed his mind and named another distant relative as his heir, but it appears no one informed William, who forever after considered himself the only true heir to the throne. This is proven because a few years later, a present washed up on the shores of Normandy. Harold Godwinson had been shipwrecked and was soon William's guest, or perhaps hostage would be a more accurate description. It was common at this time to take nobles from rival monarchies hostage and demand a ransom in the form of gold, silver, or land for their safe return. The higher the hostage's rank, the more gold was paid. However, in this case, an extremely unusual event occurred. William asked for no gold, but only Harold's oath that upon Edward the Confessor's death, Harold would give him his full support and that of his powerful family to see William crowned as their king. During their time together, Harold fought beside William in a battle where they both showed their prowess and earned each other's respect. They feasted and drank together. It's not hard to believe that a friendship and bond formed between the two men. So Harold Godwinson swore this oath of loyalty and support and was duly released. It would seem like everything was wrapped up in a tight little bundle and that events would proceed smoothly. Harold had sworn that after the king died, he'd hold the throne while Duke William sailed across the Channel and leisurely made his way to London to be crowned in Westminster Abbey. There would be feasts and celebrations, and the entire kingdom would rejoice at this coming age of plenty. Nope, this was not the case at all. As soon as Harold returned to England, he began to plot ways on getting out of his oath. There was a rule in those days that if you swore an oath under duress, for example, if you had a knife to your throat or were being tortured, then that oath was meaningless and could be discarded without any dishonor. However, this rule was reserved for extreme circumstances and did not really apply to being a noble hostage who was feasted at a duke's table. It also usually required a priest to absolve you. Yet Harold bent this rule and absolved himself. Now free from his oath to William, as we shall see, Harold had his own very different ideas about who should be the king after Edward the Confessor died. As we learned, Harold's father Godwin died peacefully and left his four sons as the most powerful earls in England, Harold first among them. Now recall Tostig, the schemer. His earldom of Northumbria revolted against his rule. He was so greedy and cruel to his subjects that even after the king had restored order, he was forced to exile Tostig Godwinson because no one would accept him as earl again. It goes to show you just how bad a ruler Tostig was, that even his powerful brothers had to agree to his exile. Their influence could save his life, nothing more. Like any proper villain, Tostig felt that he had been treated very badly and was the real victim. He flitted around the royal courts of Europe, trying to find anyone willing to help him regain his seat as earl. In turn, he offered his knowledge of the kingdom, which would be invaluable to any invading force, along with his pledge to rally all the support he could in his homeland for this would-be new claimant to the English throne. His pleas and schemes fell on deaf ears until he reached Norway and spoke to its king, Harald Sigurdsson, also known as Harald Hardrada. Hardrada translates to hard ruler or stern counsel. Since we have two heralds in our tale, I'll refer to the king of Norway as Hardrada from now on. Hardrada was a ferocious warrior, a giant of a man, standing over 6.5 feet tall, hugely muscled, every inch the quintessential Viking, yet decidedly atypical in the way he mastered warfare. He had been forced into exile as a young man because he was on the wrong side of a family dispute over who would sit upon the Norwegian throne. He was badly injured in that attempted coup, so after the battle, he had been taken north to recuperate by his band of 600 loyal Norsemen. He made his way across the mountains to Sweden and through Russia to Kiev, where he was warmly welcomed by Grand Prince Yaroslav the Wise, who put this band of warriors to good use in the constant border skirmishes with his unruly neighbors. Soon, Hardrada fell in love with the Grand Prince's beautiful daughter, but could pay no dowry worthy of a princess. He told Yaroslav that he intended to marry his daughter, And to achieve this, he would go to the one place that a Viking warrior could sell his services and grow immensely wealthy, Miklagard, or as we know it, Constantinople. It is often forgotten that centuries before Rome was sacked, the empire was split in two. The eastern half was ruled from Constantinople and continued to be prominent and powerful for nearly a millennia after the fall of the West. It is commonly called the Byzantine Empire today. The emperors had a royal bodyguard that sometimes numbered in the thousands, which was made up of northern Europeans, particularly Vikings, called the Varangian Guard. They were the most famous warriors of the day, the steel fist of the emperor. On any battlefield, wherever the fighting was fiercest, you would find the Varangians laying waste to all comers with their massive two-handed battle axes and greatswords. Hardrada and his band joined this elite group, though he kept his identity secret because he didn't want the other Norse to know he was of royal blood. After all, some of them might be allies of the half of the family he had tried to depose. Others could see him as a potential hostage to be ransomed. Yet because of his prowess on the battlefield and the deference his men paid to him, it soon became apparent who he was, and he was asked to explain his presence. As it turned out, the Byzantine court was impressed by his tale of exile, and he was quickly promoted to be a captain. Over the next decade, he would fight on battlefields as far ranging as Sicily all the way to modern Iraq. He grew immensely rich and continually sent his treasure back to Kiev for safekeeping, and as a sign that he intended to return to claim his bride. Over the course of that decade, he fought in dozens of pitched battles and was involved in the storming of over 80 fortresses. He rose to become third in command of the Varangian Guard and was so valuable to the city that when he decided it was time for him to go north and marry, the Empress Zoe forbid him to leave. So Hardrada and his men stole two ships, and in a daring escape, his ship, in the lead, made it out of the harbor just as its famous chain was raised to stop them. The other stolen ship wasn't so lucky. It hit the chain and was sunk. Hardrada went straight to Kiev and married his bride, paying a colossal dowry to the Grand Prince. You would think that he would take some time off and enjoy his wealth, but not the Hardrada. He took his bride, his men, his gold, and made for Norway, swearing that he would carve himself a kingdom or die in the attempt. He was 30, and when he arrived in Norway, people flocked to his banner. His reputation was so fierce that no one wanted to face him in battle. In fact, the king of Norway, his nephew, wanted no part of it. He sent word to Hardrada that he would share the crown with him and that they would rule together. Hardrada agreed, and though two men wore the crown of Norway, there was absolutely no doubt as to who was really in charge. It was 20 years later that a villain we know well named Tostig would enter his court and make a very interesting proposal. Hardrada listened and thought, why not? He was bored and thought the crown of England would look particularly good perched at a jaunty angle on his head. Now we've met and gotten to know our three would-be kings of England. Harold Godwinson, the Saxon hero. William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, the prototypical proto-knight. And Harold Hardrada, the last great Viking king. Three epic warriors with three very different backgrounds, yet they shared the lust for power and a desire to wear the crown. Only one will survive the year 1066, and we'll find out who when we return after this. I hope you were enjoying this episode. I know I enjoy creating them for you, and I could really use your help to keep Deep Into History alive and thriving. Please go to patreon.com/deepintohistory and pledge your support, or subscribe directly on Spotify, and you'll get to experience the smash hit crossover episode of Versus. You see, while Rome had sent its best warriors to wage war in Africa, a threat came from the far north. It started as tales of untold numbers of barbarians appearing at the edge of the known world and devouring all the small tribes in their path. A lone blood-drenched Celtic warrior made his way south to a legionary outpost on the frontier. Yet just as he arrived, he succumbed to his wounds, whispering about witches performing mass human sacrifices and bathing in blood. The Republic sent scouts to investigate, and none of them returned. Legions were dispatched only to disappear as if they had never existed, for Rome had no idea of the sheer number and warrior prowess of the Cimbri and Teutones. Join me for a journey in the dark forest beyond the Alps as we experience a series of strange events that led to Rome's worst defeat since the Republic was brought to its knees by Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae. Bloodthirsty witches, a sea of barbarians, a stolen treasure that belonged to a denizen of Olympus, a Roman's greed, all leading to the catastrophic Battle of Arausio, in a tale I call Versus The Curse of Apollo's Gold. Available now, only on Patreon and Spotify. Now back to the War of the Three Kings. Now that we have set the stage, things are going to move more quickly. On or about Christmas Day, 1065, in the Common Era, Edward the Confessor, the King of England, fell into a coma. It was custom for the nobles of the realm to gather at the royal court at this time of year to pay homage and deliver gifts to the king. Thus all were on hand as the days passed, and the confessor did not rise from his bed, and worry spread. On the 5th of January, 1066, King Edward is supposed to have come out of his coma just long enough to name Harold Godwinson as his heir, and then he closed his eyes and died. Harold wasted no time and called a council of the nobles, which the Saxons called a witan. There he shared the king's last order, after which they voted him in as king. This was Saxon custom. Even if there was an heir to the throne, the nobles would have to elect him, and thus would all be on hand to give him their oaths of fealty. Now there must have been more than a few nobles that were extremely suspicious about Harold being named heir, as it was no secret that there was no love lost between the Godwinsons and the king, because messages bearing the news of Harold's ascension soon reached the ears of Duke William across the channel in Normandy. We can only imagine the sense of betrayal, frustration, and rage that must have filled William. After all, in his mind, he was heir to the throne, and he had Harold's sworn word that he would have his full support. William sent messages to his vassals, then mounted his horse to ride to nearby Brittany to raise support, and vowed that in the coming summer there would be war, and that the crown would be his, even if he had to remove Harold's head himself to claim it. News was slower to reach across the North Sea to King Harald Hardrada in Norway. Yet as soon as he heard, he decided it was time to take up Tostig on his offer. He dispatched a schemer with a small fleet to raid the East English coast, with orders to land in Scotland and raise as much support with as many troops as he could, and rendezvous with him in the north in the summer. Then messengers were dispatched throughout Norway, calling all warriors to gather in the spring, for come summer they would set sail for blood, plunder, and glory. Hardrada had his eyes set on taking the throne and making London the capital of a new Viking empire. The title Emperor of the North Sea sounded like destiny calling for Harald Hardrada. Perhaps he would make London a metropolis to rival his former home, Constantinople. But first, he would have to conquer an entire nation, something no Viking chieftain had ever achieved in a single invasion. In Normandy, funded by his wife, Matilda of Flanders, the construction of a massive fleet of hundreds of ships was underway. Duke William had sent word to the Pope in Rome about Harold breaking his sworn oath, and named him illegitimate and a usurper. The Pope agreed and gave William his support. As a symbol to all the world that the Church recognized William as the rightful King of England, he sent a papal banner that would be held alongside William's in battle. This may seem like a token gesture, but in the context of the time, it was huge. Anyone who saw it would know that God was on William's side. It would inspire his army and cast doubt into the hearts of his enemies in this extremely religious and superstitious age. The Duke of Normandy also let it be known that the rewards for fighting for him would be enormous. If his army won, he could use the treasury of England to shower his troops in gold and offer vast lands to their commanders. And if they lost, well, the chances of a shattered army making it off the island would be slim. It was truly an all-or-nothing venture, and troops flocked to his banner. From Brittany and Burgundy came forces of cavalry, very similar to the Normans' own. These were not knights, but Milites, early heavy cavalry that fought on small, fast horses. They carried a long spear and wore chainmail, along with the iconic bullet-shaped helm with a nose guard. They also carried huge teardrop-shaped shields that could protect both rider and horse. Companies of mercenary archers arrived, along with thousands of foot soldiers. Now, in terms of numbers for William's army, some estimates go as high as 15,000, but I think 8,000 is more realistic. Half would be foot soldiers, and the other half part cavalry and archers. North, across the Channel, word of William's preparations for war reached King Harold's ears. He knew that the earliest an attack could come would be late spring, so all Harold could do was wait. The Saxon army was very different from the Normans. Each noble had a small group of professional warriors that he kept as part of his household, called housecarls. They were elite heavy infantry, who fought in a long chainmail coat that protected them from head to knee. They wielded heavy war axes as their primary weapon, whose blade was capable of decapitating a horse if wielded with enough power. On their other arm, they carried a large round shield, which they would interlink with the warriors next to them in a line to form the famous shield wall. This was an extremely effective defensive formation, which was very difficult for cavalry or even other kinds of infantry formations to penetrate. The Saxons had adopted this style of fighting from bands of Vikings that had raided England for centuries. Conventional military wisdom at the time was that the only way to counter a shield wall was to confront it with another shield wall and see which side broke first after a protracted bloody shoving match. Housecarls, as elite fighters, were expensive to maintain and their numbers were not large. In essence, the more powerful the lord or noble, the more housecarls he would have, with the king maintaining many more than anyone else. The bulk of the Saxon army consisted of the fyrd, or fyrd. These were farmers and other peasants that were required to serve for 2 to 3 months a year when their lord called upon them. Only the king could mobilize all the fyrd of the nation to assemble, and this was done very rarely, because if these peasants were with the army, their fields could not be tended. If a harvest was missed, there was a real chance of mass starvation over the winter. And as peasants, they would fight with, well, whatever they had, mostly wood chopping axes and shields. Some literally fought with pitchforks, meat cleavers, and daggers. In battle, you can think of the housecarls making a heavily armored shell around the lightly armored fyrd. Mobilizing his entire nation, King Harold could call up about 18,000 fyrd and about 4,000 housecarls. However, this would take a titanic effort as it would require all the lords of England to march their forces to one place, and supplying that number of men would be nearly impossible. Thus, when late spring came, the king sent word only to his southern earls to muster their housecarls and fyrd and to meet him on the south coast, while those in the north tended their fields. Another reason for this partial call-up was that word had reached Harold that his brother Tostig had ceased his coastal raids and landed in Scotland and was raising an army. So he had good cause to keep the north well defended. We don't know if he knew that Hardrada would be invading with his Norwegian host. We know that they were rumors, but we can guess that Harold knew at least that Tostig would be receiving some men from that quarter and invade once he was reinforced. As his army assembled, Harold assigned a large number of his men to patrol the coast in heavy longboats to look out for William's fleet. This defensive fleet was manned with some of his best warriors and would be a huge obstacle for William to overcome, as every boat was a warship designed to make short work of the large transports that the Normans would be using. With his pieces in place, he waited. The days turned to weeks, the weeks to months, and nothing. King Harold knew that Duke William was on the other side of the English Channel with an army. Yet nothing. Silence. No movement. The spies he sent across sent no word. These were most likely killed as soon as they made landfall in Normandy. You see, Duke William had a huge problem. The winds on the Channel, always notoriously temperamental, had been against him all summer. He didn't dare set sail and risk his fleet unless the conditions for the crossing were perfect. As August came to an end, both men must have felt tremendous stress. For William, it was do or die. There was no way he could maintain his army until the next campaigning season. When fall set in, his largely mercenary army would scatter to the winds. For Harold, the cost in both gold and grain was proving ruinous. He also had exceeded the 2 months of service that was expected of the feared, and was facing extreme pressure from his earls to release them so they could get in one last harvest before winter. Finally, it became too much. On the 6th of September, Harold could wait no longer and released his army. In his mind, the campaign season was over, and without the harvest, the South would starve come winter. From his point of view, it was a safe bet that the weather on the Channel would stay difficult for a few more weeks, and it was unheard of for anyone to launch a war in September. If conditions held, Harold would remain king until at least next summer, and in that time he could strengthen England's defenses and firm up his political support. In fact, it was entirely possible that if Harold had those 8 months, he would have such a firm grip on the kingdom that an invasion would no longer be feasible. He must have pondered those thoughts for a few days when suddenly he got word that the invasion had landed. But it wasn't in the south. With his army dispersed, it was with 1,000 housecarls and a few outriders that Harold headed north to face the full might of the last great Viking king. Hardrada of Norway had landed, and in doing so had made his own claim on Harold's crown, and indeed his head. The Vikings' fleet of 300 longboats had crossed the North Sea and rowed up the Humber River to within a few miles of the city of York. York was a rich and populous town. It was also the capital of Tostig's old earldom. It was the perfect point of invasion, as when Tostig joined them, the Vikings would have first-hand knowledge of the terrain and the personalities of the local lords they would be facing. When Hardrada's fleet beached, he moved towards York with 6,000 warriors. Not far from the city, they saw an army blocking their way. Two northern earls, the young brothers Edwin and Morcar, called their levies, and eager for glory, had left the relative safety of the town walls to confront the Vikings. This was particularly brazen, as we know that word was sent south for help as soon as the Viking fleet was seen coming up the Humber. All they really needed to do was man the town walls and wait for King Harold to arrive. However, the idea of having songs written about their victory outweighed any caution or common sense. So they marched their men and lined up across the march with a small stream that led to the gates of York and formed the traditional shield wall. The young earls saw that the enemy army that approached was equal to their number, so they must have felt like eternal glory was within their grasp. What they didn't know was that the experienced and wily commander Hardrada kept half of his out of sight. Once the armies were fully engaged in battle, he gave the order, and his 3,000 hidden Vikings came barreling into the Saxons' right flank. And as you can imagine, the defenders of York were utterly destroyed. Very few survived to return home to tell tales of the disaster. However, their stories must have been truly horrific because York and the surrounding areas surrendered immediately and agreed to send hostages to King Hardrada as a token of their submission. With the utter defeat of the Saxons, Hardrada and his Vikings moved to a defensive position between York and their fleet so that they could rest, feast, await the arrival of their ally Tostig, along with the promised hostages of the north. It must not have occurred to the Vikings that they were in any danger whatsoever. After all, they had crushed the power of the north in one decisive blow, with very few casualties. Little did they know, King Harold of England marched north at backbreaking speeds. His outriders had gone ahead to send out the call for all nobles along the route to muster every man they could and join the army as they made their way. Saxons mustered from far and wide rushed to join their king. Word of the Viking invasion giving all the motivation that was needed to even the most reluctant lord or peasant. It filled their hearts with great pride to see their king rushing to defend them, followed by a line of men that covered the old Roman road all the way to the horizon. Harold's army crossed the 200 miles between London and York in less than 6 days, a speed unheard of at the time. Along the way, his army had swelled to over 10,000 men. All were surely exhausted by the grueling pace, but Vikings inspired a unique fear, and the Saxons turned that fear into fuel. Every man knew that if they lost the coming battle, their wives and daughters would become the invaders' possessions, and their sons killed, or worse, sold into slavery. Saxon resolve. They would destroy their ancient enemy or die trying. The advancing column was a visual lesson in the contrast in class. The lords in their housecarls in glittering mail shirts with gigantic axes and shields. The peasants of the feared dressed in whatever protection they could afford, in many cases just their clothes and pitchforks. It was 4 days after the Battle of Gate Fulford, a sunny and unusually hot day. The Viking army was relaxing and enjoying the weather on both sides of a bridge where they awaited the arrival of their hostages from York and the surrounding areas. In fact, it was so warm that the Vikings had left their chainmail behind with their fleet. Who needs heavy and hot armor when there seemed little chance of any danger? After all, if any of the arriving hostages thought of giving them trouble, the sight of the savage Vikings and their axes would cow nearly anyone. We can imagine that their first sight of a stream of men coming over the horizon would have been of little worry to them, as they were expecting a large group of hostages to come their way. They had faced the full force of the Northern Army and crushed it. The only other enemies were far to the south, or so they thought. It must have been the glint of sunlight off the steel mail and helms shining from nearly every distant figure that first signaled their peril. As it became clear that this was indeed a Saxon army, Hardrada sounded the alarm and ordered his Vikings to form a shield wall, as the other half of his force on the far side of the bridge that separated them began sprinting across to safety and to join the line. He also sent a runner to his ships to get reinforcements. The Saxons were approaching very quickly, and the Vikings needed time. And seeing this, a giant Viking berserker screamed a challenge and ran for the bridge. He would hold the Saxon army himself and buy his comrades the time they so desperately needed. Legend says that the man was nearly 8 feet tall, and he wielded a two-handed battle axe with no shield. The sight of the lone berserker on the narrow Stamford Bridge must have given even the most hardened warrior pause. But there was no time for hesitation. The Saxon army came surging forward. Yet this nameless giant stopped the army in its tracks. He single-handedly killed 40 elite housecarls, and was only brought down when a Saxon floated under him in a barrel and drove his spear through the bridge, burying its point in the berserker's groin. He had delayed the Saxons long enough for the Vikings to form their shield wall. The Saxon army quickly rushed across the bridge and quickly formed a shield wall of their own. Due to their numbers, Harold's line was longer than the Vikings, an advantage because it made it at least possible to turn in on the Vikings' flanks and, in essence, attack on three sides. A later story says that as the Saxon line moved forward to meet the Vikings, King Harold called to Tostig and asked him to lay down his arms and accept a brother's judgment. Tostig called back that all Hardrada required was land. Harold called back that he was willing to give the Viking king land, 6 feet of land, just enough for his grave. We can imagine that the lines collided with a tremendous crash, the men in their shield walls pushing to make an opening and cut a hole in the opposing line to force a breach. Both sides were skilled in this style of warfare and fought with a practiced ferocity. The fighting was vicious and bloody in the extreme. Remember, the Vikings were unarmored, without their chainmail, so blows they normally wouldn't notice at all would bruise, crack bones, and more often than not open small cuts. We know that some Vikings simply fell dead from the loss of blood, literally death from 100 cuts. The casualties on both sides were very high. In most battles of that age, eventually one side would break and run. But this was to the death, neither side willing to give an inch. The battle went on for about 3 hours when Tostig was killed, and the Anglo-Saxons began to turn the flanks of the Viking army. It was at this critical moment that an arrow penetrated Hardrada's throat. It was a vicious wound, and choking on his own blood, the last great Viking king fell dead. Still, his army fought on savagely. Then, to the shock of the Saxons, the Vikings that had been guarding their ships arrived at the battlefield, fully armed and armored. They numbered perhaps 700 or 800 men, and they could have spelled disaster for the Saxon army if King Harold hadn't quickly adjusted his lines to hold them back. The commander of the Viking reinforcements was Hardrada's son-in-law, a man named Einstein Ori. When he saw that his king was dead and that the battle had degenerated into a bloodbath, he called a halt to the fighting and asked Harold for terms. After a brief back and forth, The king of the Saxons agreed to let the Vikings leave without ransoms if they swore never to return to England. After Ori swore to this, the Vikings gathered their wounded and returned to their ships. We don't know the exact number of their losses suffered, but they were vast. To give you an idea of the scale of the slaughter, the Vikings had invaded with 300 ships. Yet when they left, they only needed 24 to carry the survivors on the long voyage home. Doing some quick math, we can see that at least 75% were dead. Thus, it's hard to overstate the scale of the slaughter at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Although victorious, King Harold's army had suffered tremendous losses as well. Hundreds of his best troops, his housecarls, were dead. Thousands were badly wounded and would succumb to their wounds if they didn't get time to recover. It's doubtful that anyone escaped the battle without at least minor wounds. So Harold ordered a camp set for his army to rest and ordered a few days of feasting to celebrate their victory and honor their fallen. It was on the third day that word arrived that Duke William, the bastard of Normandy, had landed far to the south with a mighty army, marching under a papal banner. It must have been with disbelief, shock, and then grim determination that Harold ordered all that could march to follow him to meet this dire threat. Elsewhere, Duke William had landed at Pevensey on the south coast. It is said that while taking his first steps ashore, he tripped and fell face first onto the sand. This could have been taken as a very bad omen by his superstitious troops. But William kissed the ground, got up quickly, and held up his fists full of sand, symbolically claiming the land as his own. Once his army of 8,000 had disembarked from his fleet, they rode for their nearby town of Hastings, which they easily took. William had the town fortified and set out raiding parties to gather any resources they could find, but primarily to harry the land. This was a provocation and challenge, for you see, William and his army were on foreign soil, enemy territory. He needed to force a decisive battle as soon as possible, for when winter set in, he would be cut off from supplies and support from Normandy due to the reliably horrible weather on the English Channel. To the north, it took Harold a week to march back to London. His core force of elite housecarls had been severely depleted by the battle at Stamford Bridge. Actually, let's call it what it was, a war fought in one battle with the Vikings. Many of the housecarls that were able to march south were wounded. All were exhausted. It shows how devoted and tough these men were that they were able to make the march at all. The alarm had been raised and the call had gone out. Fresh levies of furs were arriving daily. Harold's brothers begged him to stay in London and to continue to raise more men, while they went south to confront William with the levies at hand. Perhaps inspired and confident from the recent victory, Harold said he would lead the army himself, especially once word of the Norman raids on southern towns reached him and had its desired effect. Harold took these raids for what they were, a challenge, and he accepted. There could be only one king, and it was time to destroy William the Bastard and his Norman army once and for all. Resolved on his course, Harold allowed only a few days for the fur to gather, and then he marched south, knowing that if he failed, he would never see London again. Even though they were battle-weary, morale in the Saxon army was very high. The veterans of the Battle of Stamford Bridge were telling the newly recruited Ferd of their victory and how their king fought in the front line. This gave the militiamen heart and confidence. It appears Harold must have been hoping to take William by surprise, much as he had the Vikings in the north. However, as his army approached Hastings, it was spotted by Norman scouts, who in turn had been seen by the Saxons. Thus Harold decided to place his army more or less astride the road to London, blocking the way to the capital. Even though surprise was lost, Harold got to choose the battlefield, which also gave huge advantages. He chose wisely and would make his stand on a hill called Senlac, just a few miles from Hastings. Senlac Ridge is an interesting landmark. The approach to it is very long, but not extremely steep. A steady incline from the base all the way to the long flat top. It also had thick, nearly impassable woods on each side, which would protect the Saxon flanks. At the rear of the ridge, there was a long, deep depression that could act as a ditch if they were forced to retreat, greatly slowing any pursuit. Harold knew that he was dangerously low on housecarls. The Ferd were more than capable of holding their place in the shield wall, but they lacked the training and discipline to do much more than stand their ground. His plan hinged on having a few lines of experienced warriors in the front, with the furred units coming to replace them as needed. All they needed to do was hold and hold and hold until the Normans gave up. It was truly the best possible position for the Saxon army and gave them every conceivable advantage. Harold gave the order, and the approximately 10,000 Saxons formed their shield wall, the same formation that generations of their ancestors had assumed countless times to confront a foe. If they could just hold the line, victory would be theirs. Against this, Duke William brought 4,000 infantry, 2,000 archers, and 2,000 cavalry. As mentioned before, he had assembled his army from all over Northern Europe, and as a result, they were all professional soldiers, many actual mercenaries, others full time warriors in service to a lord. They were disciplined soldiers before joining William, and after a summer of his relentless drills, they were a well oiled war machine capable of acting in concert with each other. In many ways, the battle that is about to unfold is between a very old way of fighting, lining up in a shield wall, against a rediscovered means of fighting with mixed styles of specialized units working together. Duke William opened the battle with his archers in front, the infantry lined up behind, and the cavalry split between the flanks and as a mobile reserve to exploit any opening in the shield wall. The order for the first volley of arrows was given at approximately 9 a.m. on October 14th, 1066. We can imagine the roaring taunts and insults coming from the Saxons up on the hill 200 yards away, answered by the thrum of 2,000 bowstrings snapping forward. Then sudden silence from the hill as the Saxons tried to angle their shields towards the arrows, followed by another thrum 10 to 20 seconds later. Just as a loud thwack of arrows hitting shields was heard, the third volley was being released with another thrum. There was a problem for Duke William, though. The volleys of arrows were proving to be very ineffective. You see, it's very difficult to shoot uphill at a target. Arrows that would normally strike the mark ended up in the ground in front of the Saxons, flying harmlessly over their heads or easily caught in their shields. We need to remember that 2,000 archers firing on a line of men at a very conservative rate of 5 hours per minute. That's 10,000 arrows every single minute. This should have been a huge factor in the battle. In the right conditions, such as flat ground, focused fire could punch holes in enemy lines before the infantry even engaged. This would later be called an arrow storm. However, at Hastings, the archers would be relegated to providing cover fire for the infantry and cavalry as they advanced and withdrew. The archers ceased fire as the Norman infantry advanced. Given the disparity in numbers and the sheer length of the shield wall, remember it covered the entire hilltop. William was forced to send the infantry forward in two split forces, attacking each flank, leaving the center of the shield wall for the cavalry to attack as soon as the infantry engaged. Seeing the advance, the Saxons would have begun their shouts and taunts with renewed vigor. After fending off the rather pathetic arrow attack, the disciplined ranks of Norman infantry marched in lockstep, trying to keep the slope from disrupting their line. At 50 yards from the shield wall, they would have been hit by a non-stop barrage of spears, rocks, throwing axes, and anything the Saxons could get their hands on. At 20 yards, the Norman infantry would have let out a war cry of their own and charged the last few yards to close with the enemy. Duke William led the charge of Meelites on the center of the shield wall himself. This kind of cavalry was excellent in melee combat, the mounted rider having the huge advantage of height. Also, the horses themselves were warriors in their own right, trained to kick, bite, and trample the enemy. But this kind of early cavalry lacked long lances and armor for the mounts that would make knights so effective in the centuries to come. Their charge lacked the shock power to break the shield wall. A good way to think of Norman Meelites is as extremely mobile mounted heavy infantry. At this very early stage of the battle, they would have hurled their spears at the Saxons and then fought with their long cavalry swords. It's very difficult for us to imagine what it must have been like for the housecarls in the shield wall. Every warrior trying to cover himself and the warrior beside him with his round shield, his heavy war axe in his other hand, ready to strike. The warriors in the lines behind would put their shields to the backs of the warriors in front to brace the line for the charge. It must have been terrifying, as they were completely unused to facing cavalry. They would have to try and deflect the spears and immediately engage man and horse. With the speed of the spears thrown by skilled arms, it's certain that more than a few punched through shields and buried themselves in the Saxons in the front line. We know that the axes of the housecarls were more than capable of killing a horse in one blow, and thus they were the first target. The hideous screams of the first horses to be mutilated by the war axes would have sent a chill down the spines of even the most hardened warriors. As the battle progressed, the Normans would surge and attack, then withdraw a short distance to rest before charging again. This was done in good order. As a unit withdrew, the archers below would fire at that section of the shield wall. It was constant and relentless, and this went on for hours. To give you an idea of the savagery of the fighting, Duke William had at least 2 horses killed under him, each time having to remount, take off his helm, and ride across his army to show that he still lived, as a rumor of his death could send his troops running, because if William was dead, there was no point for them to keep fighting. Casualties on both sides were high, but definitely higher for the Normans. Given the disparity in numbers and the fact that in the back of their minds the Norman troops knew that retreat was at least possible, this was not a tenable situation. The shield wall was holding and showing no signs of weakening. Something had to change, and William knew it. Exactly what happened next is a matter of debate. Some historians believe it was an accident or mere happenstance. Others believe it was planned. Given what we know of William and the kind of warrior he was, I believe that he saw what was happening to his army and knew that if this kept up, his troops would lose heart and his attempt to claim the crown would end in ruin. Having drilled his army all summer, he gambled that they would be able to pull off in battle what they had done in training. He ordered the infantry on his left wing to fully engage. Once that was achieved, instead of an orderly withdrawal, they were to turn and run a very long distance down the hill, as if fleeing the battle in terror. He hoped that the undisciplined feared units on the Saxon right, seeing the enemy fleeing, would run after them to slaughter the now easy targets. Historically, when an army was in flight was when the most casualties took place. The target would just be too tempting to resist. And the ploy worked. Seeing the fleeing enemy, over the cries of Harold and his officers to stay in formation, the Saxon right chased them down the hill. The reason we can be relatively certain that this was indeed a ploy is that when the fleeing Norman infantry reached the base of the hill, seemingly in unison, they stopped and turned to confront the approaching Saxons. Within moments, the Saxons were being charged on 3 sides by Norman cavalry who had them on open ground. They were quickly surrounded and slaughtered to the last man. There were still thousands upon thousands of Saxons on the hill, but the integrity of their shield wall had been broken, and they could now be flanked. At this moment, King Harold must have known that his situation was desperate. He would have tried to order the shield wall to thin and fill the gap on the right, but one of the disadvantages of having your commander in a shield wall was that it was very difficult for him to communicate any orders any meaningful distance. And because of this, the moment where the Saxon flank could have been reformed passed, and they were being charged by Norman cavalry. Even as this attack happened, Duke William repeated the same feint retreat tactic on the opposite side of the shield wall. Though not as successful, a large number of feared did fall for the ruse and were duly surrounded and slaughtered, further weakening the Saxons' position. William took full advantage of the chaos he had caused to the Saxon line and committed all his forces in a full-scale attack all along its length. The archers moved forward to retrieve arrows and began firing over the heads of their army into the rear of the Saxon shield wall. They would also take advantage of any gaps that appeared to shoot directly at individual targets. At these ever closer rangers, the arrows started taking a toll, with the shield wall being pushed to its breaking point. This went on for hours, and as the sun began to set, King Harold of England took a stray arrow in the eye and fell dead. Seeing their fallen king, the remaining Saxon army lost heart and fled the field. And as the Normans began to pursue, the last Saxon king was trod into the mud under the hooves of Roman horses. At least this is what the Bayeux Tapestry and many historians would have us believe. There is another, and in my mind more plausible account of the way the battle ended. From a Latin text called the Con. It says that Duke William was utterly frustrated that after all of his brilliant maneuvers, the Saxons had not surrendered or fled, and seemed likely to fight to the last man. So he decided that enough was enough. So he created a death squad to seek out and kill Harold, knowing that it was only his will and presence that kept the Saxons going. The death squad probably consisted of 20 to 30 of his best warriors, mounted on their fiercest mounts. Since Harold's banner flew in the center, they knew approximately where he would be. They held back and waited to find the king in the front line with his remaining housecarls around him. And when they saw him, they charged. With that many spears directed at him, Harold and his immediate bodyguard had no chance. He was taken in the chest by a spear and fell to his knees. The death squad then made a ring around Harold. He was brutally beheaded by a blow from a sword. They then disemboweled him and cut off his genitals. And in a final act of savagery, Duke William ordered the body of the anointed king to be utterly destroyed. Whatever actually happened, the Saxons fled, and as the Normans pursued, they fell into the ditch that Harold had so carefully chosen to protect his army's rear. It also allowed many Saxons to flee and spread the word that King Harold was dead and that William was victorious. The few thousand Saxons that got away did not change the fact that the flower of Saxon England was dead on the battlefield. The War of the Three Kings was over, and the crown, bought with so much blood, would rest upon the brow of William, no longer the bastard of Normandy, but forever after known as William the Conqueror, King of England. As a postscript to the Battle of Hastings, and to highlight the cultural barriers that existed between the Normans and the Saxons, when William and his army were making their procession through the streets of London, crowds came out to greet them, and were actually cheering their new king and chanting his name. Yet the army could not understand the language and took the shouts as aggression. They slaughtered the crowd and cut a bloody path to Westminster, where William was formally crowned king. These fundamental differences in cultural understanding would make William's reign one of constant oppression, bloodshed, and tyranny, whose symbols can be seen all over England today in the form of Norman castles. I hope you enjoyed The War of the Three Kings Revisited. Thank you for listening to Deep into History. Please tell everyone you know about this show and leave a 5-star review wherever you listen. You can support my art by going to patreon.com/deepintohistory or directly on Spotify. You can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky at Deep into History to get your daily blast from the past, as well as maps, links, and visuals for every tale. And as always, my dear friend, take care of yourself. I truly look forward to the next time we go deep.